companion planting. It's one of those topics we love, but we can easily get confused by. But what if the way we naturally pair foods in the kitchen has been quietly teaching us companion planting all along? Now, if you love cooking, you instinctively know what goes together. Tomatoes with basil, onions with peppers, carrots with celery. You really don't have to think about that too much. But if you're more like me, cooking is not intuitive, and I am definitely not a natural in the kitchen. Actually, when I do decide to whip something up, my husband looks at me like, "Do you know what you're doing?" Because typically I have to follow recipes very closely. But even then, whether you love cooking or you just follow instructions like I do, you start to notice something. The same vegetables and herbs show up together again and again. And that's when something interesting occurred to me. One day it hit me. What if the combinations we're so used to seeing in the kitchen are giving us clues to what actually belongs together in the garden and what doesn't? Because here's the thing, as a beginning gardener, a lot of us learn companion planting like it's a chemistry exam. Charts, rules, exceptions, warnings, and all of this feels confusing and impossible to remember. But cooking, even if you're not a chef like me, cooking is intuitive. It's cultural, it's seasonal, and it's built on generations of trial and error. And when you start lining up what we naturally cook together with what actually grows well together, something clicks. Suddenly, companion planting stops feeling mysterious and starts feeling obvious. So today I want to explore that idea with you. We're going to look at the plants you already know, foods you've probably cooked or eaten your whole life, and let's see how those same relationships play out in the garden. We'll look at some natural pairings, both in the kitchen and the garden, as well as unnatural pairings. Those you can't imagine eating together are often the same ones that don't grow well together. Now, before we dive in, I have one quick announcement for you. Starting on February 10th, I'll be hosting a live training called the Productive Garden Masterclass. You'll have multiple dates and times to choose from, and we will focus on helping you plan a garden that's productive, realistic, and actually fits your life. And this is what I'm excited about. Just for registering, you will be entered in to win a giveaway featuring some of my favorite garden products from Greenstock, from Garden in Minutes, Organic Rev, and Epic Gardening. And we're going to have some of those products as live giveaways in the class if you're there. You can learn more and save your spot now because spots are limited for each class by going to journeywithjill.net/masterclass. Now, more on that later. For now, I want us to dive in because this is a fun subject I have been waiting to talk to you about for so long. So let's talk about companion planting today. All right, so what I want to do first is I want to look at the crops that we grow in our garden, and then I want to look at what do we typically use with it when we're cooking. And number one, because most of us grow it, is tomatoes. Even if you don't like fresh tomatoes like me, you probably like it cooked in some way. And the most obvious pairing is basil. We use tomatoes and basil in Italian dishes, and basil is a perfect companion for tomatoes. I've never had a basil plant not do well with tomatoes. Even if the tomatoes shade it out, it usually finds a way to grow up, even if it doesn't look that great. Tomatoes and basil, perfect companions. They don't compete with each other. And a lot of people believe that basil helps with pest deterrent, which makes sense. It has an aroma that does that. I wouldn't guarantee that as like your pest deterrent plan, but it definitely can help. The next is tomatoes and onions. These are paired often in both Italian and in Mexican dishes, and honestly, probably a lot more besides that. Jalapeno peppers are also paired in Mexican dishes like salsa, as is cilantro. Onions, jalapenos, and cilantro are all really good companions for tomatoes. Here's the thing you need to know about each of those though. I really like companion planting onions with tomatoes, partly because in my season, I plant onions earlier than I do tomatoes. So onions actually need a lot of sun early on in their growth, which is typically early spring when tomatoes are not planted yet or they're just really small. And so I'll plant them and then I'll leave room to plant tomatoes beside them later. So it's kind of like a companion planting slash relay planting, which we'll talk about in the masterclass all together. And they do grow well together. Jalapeno peppers are a great companion for tomatoes as well. I like jalapeno peppers a little bit better than bell peppers as far as planting with tomatoes, just because the jalapeno peppers the plants tend to be a little bit smaller. When I have planted tomatoes and bell peppers together, they grow well together, but the bell peppers sometimes need a little bit more sunlight. So if you plant bell peppers with tomatoes, maybe stretch them out, like space them out a little bit further than you would maybe jalapeno peppers, because they tend to be a larger plant. That's a little bit meta, but that's just been my experience in the past. But jalapeno peppers are really great. I would just recommend not planting it on the north side of a tomato, because anything on the north side of tomato is going to eventually get shade, especially peppers and tomatoes, which grow together during the same season. Now, moving on to cilantro. Cilantro makes sense intuitively because you naturally think cilantro and salsa, right? The problem with cilantro is that it grows in the cold season and it doesn't like the warmth that tomatoes like. So if you want to grow cilantro and tomatoes together in the garden, thinking that you're going to harvest them at the same time, unless you live in an area with really mild summers, you're probably not going to find that. What you're going to find instead is that the cilantro will grow well early in the season. You got to plant it really soon, and it will eventually start to flower about the same time that tomatoes start getting going. Now, that may feel like a failure in the garden, and I know I felt that the first couple of times I did that, because of course, who doesn't want salsa without cilantro, unless you have that gene that you don't like cilantro. But anyway, the great part about cilantro planted next to tomatoes is that when they start to flower, they attract all sorts of beneficial insects like syrphid flies and parasitic wasps that prey on some of the worms that tomato plants are typically plagued with, like hornworms and armyworms. So even though you may not have cilantro and tomatoes harvesting at the same time, they're still really good pairings for those purposes. Now, you may be asking me, well, how am I supposed to grow cilantro and tomatoes together for salsa? A couple of things you can do. Quick tip: you can harvest your cilantro early and just put it in the freezer. And then if you're making salsa, it's really easy just to snip those frozen leaves into your salsa. Or you can try microgreens and plant cilantro microgreens all during the summer so you have them fresh. I've done both. One takes a little bit more effort than the other, but those are a couple options for you. The next section I want to bring you to for ideal pairings, both in the garden and in the kitchen, was actually inspired by a student of mine. I planned her garden, and she is a chef, and she mentioned that she wanted to plant the Trinity together in her garden, which I didn't know what that was. I mean, I'm thinking biblical, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, but she says there's actually a Trinity in cooking, and that Trinity that she recommended, and that Trinity was onions, carrots, and celery. Now, stay with me. There are actually two trinities in cooking, depending on the culture that you are thinking about. And I'm going to talk about both of them because both of them actually work great in the garden. But let's talk about the traditional trinity. This hails from Europe, and I can't remember if it was Italy or Greece or somewhere in Europe. But onions, carrots, and celery. Now, these are really great to grow together for several reasons. They all have about the same growth habit as far as height, so they're not going to shade each other. They also have different growth habits as far as carrots are going to go really deep into the soil. Onions are going to kind of stay soil level with, a few inches below. And then celery is going to be growing a little bit higher. They also can be fit into a small garden space. You're looking at 4 onions per square foot, 1 celery plant per square foot. I usually do about 16 carrots per square foot. So if you're doing square foot gardening, these are really great to put next to each other. And they also grow at approximately the same time of year because they're all cool season plants. I'm usually planting onions and carrots about the same time, onion transplants and carrots about the same time. And then celery, even though it's a cool season crop, it doesn't love freezes. Can't handle them as well as onions and carrots do. So I'll plant them usually a couple of weeks later. But still, they typically grow about the same period of time in the garden. And obviously, if you've done any kind of cooking with soups and stews or lots of different options, you know that those three vegetables go really well together. But there's a second trinity, and I didn't realize this, and it's called the Cajun Trinity. Those of you guys who are listening from Louisiana can probably spot this pretty easily. And there's one difference here in the Cajun Trinity. It's celery, onions, and bell peppers. Now, I found this interesting. So I was doing some research, like why would you swap out carrots for bell peppers? Because that's a little bit different. But what I found is that those who started cooking that settled into Louisiana, which is going to be a little bit hotter. Maybe the soil had something to do with it. I'm not sure, but they found that carrots didn't grow as well there as bell peppers did. Now, I still find that really interesting because onions and celery are cool season crops. I'm planting them early in the season, probably about a month before my average last frost date, but I'm not even planting bell peppers until a couple of weeks after my average last frost date. So there's about a 4 to 6 week gap between planting celery, onions, and bell peppers. And it's kind of interesting that these three would be paired together. But what I have found in my own garden is that, again, onions and celery can be planted early, but then I'll leave a space for bell peppers. They're usually planted about 1 per square foot. I'll leave that to plant later, and then they grow at the same time. And then as the bell peppers get tall and wide and they can start to shade the celery, this is actually really good because celery doesn't like the heat. So these are good companion combinations. You just have to know that we've got 2 cool season crops and 1 warm season crop, and that's definitely going to affect when we plant it. But once it's all planted, they're actually really great in the garden. You've probably heard me talk a little bit about the cool season crops and warm season crops. And if this is a new concept for you, definitely come to the masterclass on February 10th or 11th. We have a couple of different days for that because I will be going through that all in detail. But we have a lot of companions to get to, and I want to get to as many as I can, and some of the ones that don't go well together. So let's move on to potatoes. Potatoes are a little challenging to plant next to other crops because eventually you're going to have to harvest the potatoes, and that's going to create a lot of root disturbance, and you want to be careful what you plant next to them and how close to them so as not to disturb the roots of anything that's already growing. But in my mind, I was thinking, okay, what do I typically eat with potatoes? And the first thing I thought, I don't know why, but the first thing I thought was potato salad. And with potato salad, I have celery and onions. Now, potatoes, celery, and onions are all technically, I guess, cool season crops. Potatoes is kind of weird because it likes the cool weather, but it also doesn't like freezes. So they're just a little bit different than celery and onions that way, but still they're growing about the same time. And they're probably going to harvest around similar times. At least they do in my garden. Usually my potatoes and my onions and celery are going to be harvesting somewhere in the June timeframe here in Arkansas. But that may vary, obviously, depending on where you live. But the key is, even if they grow well together, remember, we do have the possibility of harvesting the potatoes, which is digging up the potatoes. So keep them separated enough so that if the onions aren't ready or if the celery isn't ready quite yet, they're not going to disturb the roots. However, like I said, I haven't really had that issue because usually they're harvesting about the same time. But still, it's always a good idea to keep them separated enough. Now, that may seem vague. What I'm saying is that if you're planting a square foot of potatoes, and we're talking about white potatoes, not sweet potatoes, then those potatoes are going to stay near that square foot. So I might give maybe 1 square foot of leeway before I plant another crop like onions or like celery. So it's not like you have to put them in, different parts of the bed, just a little bit of extra space to help them not disturb the soil if you harvest them first or if you grab some new potatoes out of the top. Next, let's talk about cabbage. The first thing I thought about was coleslaw. This would be carrots and onions. Cabbage, carrots, and onions do grow well together. They are all cool season crops. They're going to be planted and grown about the same time. The only caution that I would give you with planting these together is look on your seed packet at the variety of cabbage that you have and consider how wide it's going to grow. Cabbage is a very low growing crop and it's going to grow wide, not tall. So you don't want the cabbage leaves to be shading the carrot, leaves or the onion leaves because they're going to need as much sun as they can get early in the season. What I will normally do, depending on the cabbage variety, is I would probably plant cabbage and then skip a square and then plant carrots. But then that square that you skip, I would totally add greens because greens are a great companion for cabbage, and I found that to work really well. And when you add companions like that, there's way less weeding. But still, they grow really well together, and they're going to be harvesting at the same time. So when the cabbage comes to harvest, we've got carrots and we've got onions, and we can make summer coleslaw all at the same time. So it all works well. All right, let's move on to the warm season crops, and let's talk about cucumbers. My favorite companions with cucumbers are dill and onions. Now remember, onions are cool season crops. They are going to be planted way before cucumbers are, but in your garden plan, it's totally perfect. But when you're planting your garden, plan for adding cucumbers near your onions if you would like, because by the time your cucumbers are planted and start growing, the onions don't need as much sun and can probably even benefit from some shade. And then let's talk about dill. Dill, like many herbs, you can just tuck in here and there. Dill is a perfect companion for cucumbers. It's kind of that cool season crop, but it can be planted kind of flexibly. You can plant it a couple weeks before your average last frost date, but you can also plant it a little bit later in the season. But regardless, you can tuck your dill in with the cucumbers. This is obviously a great option for pickles or tzatziki sauce. I know I've loved making that with sour cream or yogurt, however you want to make tzatziki. It's a perfect summer treat. And planting them all together is a great idea to have them all. Now, one thing about onions is they will probably, depending on your location, harvest before the cucumbers will start harvesting. And that's okay, because if you cure them, which means you dry them in a dry location until the stalk dries out, then you can keep them for a long time. Guys, I'm still using my onions from my June harvest last year, and only a few are starting to sprout. Depends on the variety. That's a whole other episode. But the point is that it doesn't really matter when the onions harvest, because they will keep well as long as they haven't bolted and they harvest naturally. Totally other subject, but they're still a great companion. Okay, let's move on to bell peppers. Now, bell peppers I find to be really good companions with onions, because I'm thinking fajitas. Now, again, onions are cool season crops. We're planting them first. We're adding bell peppers. We kind of already talked about with the Cajun Trinity. But the reason I think about this is because I love harvesting bell peppers and onions and slicing them and freezing them all together. And then I have a packet of bell peppers and onions ready for fajitas whenever I want them in the off season. Plus, then you can obviously harvest them fresh during the harvest season of peppers and then eat them fresh, but also takes well to preservation. All right, let's move to squash. Squash is another one that's kind of hard to figure out what to plant with it, because squash grows really wide. Doesn't grow super tall unless you want to kind of trellis it up a little bit. I'm talking about summer squash, not winter squash. But generally the habit's going to be really wide. I usually give it about 2 to 3 square feet, 3 ideal for each plant, just because it does grow so wide. So how do you handle companion planting if you know it's going to grow that much? Personally, when I'm planting a young squash plant, I hate having extra bare soil because that's where weeds are going to go. I am usually planting an undercrop of something like nasturtium or alyssum, or even some early greens that I could harvest while it's taking up that space. But then outside of that, onions are a great option besides squash. There's some resources that say they're good to help repel squash bugs. I'll tell you, if you want to repel squash bugs, good luck. I'm still looking for that perfect silver bullet, but maybe it can't hurt anyway. But if you are looking for, a place to put your onions, probably a couple of square feet outside of where you're going to plant squash is a great idea. And we know that squash and onions are amazing sauteed together. So again, that's kind of where that intuitive pairing goes. Okay, let's move through these last ones before we get to bad companions, just to be able to get through these quickly. There's so many, which I found so fun as I was researching for this, but I know you don't want to be here all day. So let's talk about lettuce. Lettuce is a quick grower. It's a cool season crop, shallow roots. And so it grows really well with radishes and carrots, because we've got lettuce that has shallow roots and it doesn't grow very tall, but the radishes and carrots do need light. So it's great that the lettuce isn't really going to shade them out, but then they grow more down into the ground. Now, cucumbers are also a really good pairing with lettuce. Think about, you want cucumbers on your summer salads, right? Well, the cucumbers will be planted later because they're not cool season crops, but this actually serves as a benefit. And it's something that I used last year, is that you can plant your lettuce, and this may be even a later planting of more heat tolerant lettuce. Plant your lettuce a little later in the spring and then plan on planting cucumbers next to it. And then as the cucumbers grow, they're going to provide shade for the lettuce that may give you a little bit of extra time before the lettuce becomes bitter. If you want to think about it like this, you could put your cucumbers on the south side of your lettuce as you're going into summer, so that the lettuce is on the north side and gets a little bit more shade. Great combination. The next pairing is peas. Whether you're growing shelling peas or snap peas, you're growing them early in the season. They're a cool season crop, so what can you plant with them? Carrots is a great option to plant next to peas. Just make sure that the carrots are at least on the east or west side, but ideally on the south side, because again, early in the season, carrots need as much sun as you can give them. But if your peas are on the north side and they're growing up and your carrots are on the south side growing, right below them, they can both grow at the same time. And think about it, what did we grow up eating? Even if it was mushy on our cafeteria trays as elementary school kids, peas and carrots, right? Peas and carrots, they just go together. You can just say it together and it makes sense. Well, they can grow together too, as long as we keep in mind shading. And by the same token, lettuce can go next to peas just as well. And it's not as picky about sunlight like carrots are. So you could do maybe carrots on one side, lettuce on the other, and a lot of us put peas in our salads. So that also makes sense to go together. Okay, let's wrap up these good pairings with a couple of midsummer good combination. One of them is beans and corn. Now, you may have heard of the Three Sisters method, where you do corn stalks and you put pole beans and they climb it. Personally, I have not had the best experience with that. I have found that the pole beans tend to choke out the corn just a little bit, but I have a lot of people that have tried it and it worked okay for them. Still, whether you do pole beans growing up your corn, or you do corn and then maybe you do some bush beans on the south side so they can get plenty of sun, or even on the east or the west side, just making sure they get plenty of sun. This would be a good combination, partly because, and this is something I didn't learn until I did the Thanksgiving episode where I talked about growing foods that you'd put on your Thanksgiving table. Beans and corn eaten together represent a complete protein. So that makes sense that they are paired well together, whether that is sweet corn and snap green beans or shelling beans and cornbread. Still, these are really good combinations if you're trying to squeeze in some space. Again, just keep in mind the shading. It might be one of those things where you start bush beans earlier and then start your corn a couple of weeks later, so the bush beans can get a head start and get plenty of sun. And then also, we know that beans fix nitrogen in the soil, which can always help corn because corn likes a lot of nitrogen. And then finally, we've got okra. Now, I personally have grown up eating only fried okra. I started roasting it as I got to be an adult. I love that too. But I know some of you guys, especially if you're from the South, you know that okra is often paired with tomatoes and peppers, whether that's in gumbo or stewed okra with tomatoes and peppers. There's lots of options. They grow well together. Just keep in mind shade, because okra, depending on the variety, can grow tall and can branch out, and you don't want peppers underneath that and get shaded out too much. So keep in mind the shade, but otherwise they actually grow pretty well together, and they're going to be harvesting about the same time. So you've got okra and tomatoes and peppers all ready to cook in one dish if you would like. Hopefully next after the break, we're going to talk about companions that don't make that much sense and why you'll be able to cue in to why they don't pair as well in the garden. Just taking a quick break to tell you about seed starting products you'll want to know about from our sponsor, Organic Rev. If you are getting ready to start seeds for your spring garden, this is the time to get those seedlings the strongest start possible. And that's why I want to tell you about the new Superior Seed Starts bundles from Organic Rev. Rev has been a part of my seed starting routine for years. I mix a splash into my bottom watering trays to promote early root development and stronger seedlings. But now Organic Rev has bundled it with a few powerful companions to take things even further. There are 3 options. You've got the core bundle that has Organic Rev and AMP microalgae to improve germination speed and success. The Plus bundle, which adds eco-organic to support seedlings after they emerge. And the Pro bundle, perfect if you're starting your whole spring garden from seed. It includes a larger bottle of Rev, all the extras, plus a free bag of Dakota Soil Implant Enhancer. If seed starting is on your to-do list, check out these bundles at organicrev.com and you can use my code JILL10 to save 10% off of your order. I've been using Organic Rev in my garden for about 5 years and I can truly tell a difference in my garden. I know you will too. Again, organicrev.com and use my promo code JILL10. When we think about bad companions, this is kind of a place where I get a little irritated with some of the charts because I'm not really a rule breaker. I like to follow rules, but I have tested and broken some rules and have been like, this wasn't so bad. I think one of the ones that I did that I didn't know that I wasn't supposed to do is I did beans and garlic together and they both did just fine. And supposedly you're not supposed to plant alliums with beans, which is something that I have talked about because I haven't specifically planted onions with beans, but onions and garlic are alliums. But anyway, this is one of my pet peeves because if somebody tells me that some crops don't go well together, I want you to tell me why, not just because. But I feel like an easier way maybe is to consider, is this something we naturally cook with in the kitchen? Is this something that naturally goes together? And when I started thinking about some of the options of some of the vegetables that I grow in my garden and what I'd be like, no, I don't think I would eat that together. There were some real reasons why they don't grow so well in the garden together. So let's go through these. There's not that many, thankfully. I feel like we have way more options with companion planting when we're thinking, especially when we're thinking about shade, than anything else than we realize, but there are some things that we kind of want to avoid. The first one is tomatoes and potatoes. Now, I'm sure somebody can think about a dish that you eat with tomatoes and potatoes, but I have not been able to come up with one off the top of my head. And I'm not meaning like you can't have them on the same plate, like French fries and ketchup obviously is an exception. I'm talking about more like cooked together. They are not the same primary ingredient in many fresh dishes like squash and onions. And here's why they don't go so well together in the garden. Both are heavy feeders. They require a lot of nutrition and they both, because they're in the same plant family, they also tend to take up the same type of nutrients, but they do it a lot. Whereas tomatoes and peppers are the same plant family, but they don't seem to be bothered as much. But tomatoes and potatoes require quite a bit of nutrition. But they're also prone to similar diseases. And this is where I would not put them together personally because early blight is a major issue in my garden, septoria leaf spot. It affects both of these. And so I would not put them right next to each other. It just makes it easy for these diseases to hop from one to the other. And it can be the same for pests. There are a lot of the same pests that like tomato leaves, that like potato leaves. So in general, I put tomatoes and potatoes in completely different beds. The next pairing that I'd avoid is fennel and almost anything. So fennel has a very specific and overpowering flavor, and you don't just casually toss it into everything. It has to be used strategically in the kitchen. The same is true in the garden. Now, I have not really tested this. I do have some fennel in my garden. It's more of the herb fennel. It's not the bulb fennel, and it's used in the margin of my garden. But I will tell you, it takes over. Oh my goodness. It's like a weed. And so this is definitely not something, this particular type of fennel, I would want in my regular garden for that purpose. And all that to say, I have not grown fennel with my vegetables, thankfully now that I realize that. But from what I have read, it is very famously unfriendly to many crops. So if you're growing fennel, you might want to keep it in its own space. The next pairing that probably doesn't go so well together is squash and potatoes. Again, You may have squash and potatoes on your dinner plate, but they're rarely cooked together in the same dish for the same reason as in the garden. They're both space hogs. They both need a lot of space. Even though I said that potatoes will be about 1 square foot, it grows tall and it grows wide, whereas squash grows really broad. And they both demand a lot from the soil. I have tested these combinations a couple of times, and I have found that I have not had the best of success with squash when I plant it next to potatoes. It seems the squash just doesn't do as well. I haven't really compared how did the potatoes do, but I am typically going to, I wouldn't have a problem having them in the same bed as long as the squash had plenty of room to grow, but I would separate them a little bit more. This is more of like not red light, but more like yellow light, and make sure that each of the crops has plenty of space. The next pairing is corn and tomatoes. And yes, sometimes we do eat them together. I love corn salsa. But the problem is they are both very nutrient hungry. They both like nitrogen. They both want sun, and they both need quite a bit of space. And another thing about corn and tomatoes is they tend to attract the same type of insects, armyworms in particular. So having them together might give those worms a little bit of an easy buffet. Not saying that separating them is going to keep all the worms away, but make them work a little bit for it, right? So those are ones that I probably would keep them a little bit more away from each other. And here's the thing with all of the pairings we've talked about today, once you start noticing the patterns, it's hard not to see them everywhere. What belongs together on your plate often belongs together in your garden. And when you let that guide your planting decisions, things start to feel simpler, maybe more intentional, and perhaps a little less overwhelming, especially if you're seeing companion planting charts and are trying to memorize what goes with something and what doesn't. If you're an experienced gardener, you start to know these intuitively and you start to test different things. And I hope that you will. I hope you'll test everything that I've talked about today, including the things I've said not to do. Maybe you want to test. Maybe you're a rule breaker, and let's just see if this actually pans out or not. Regardless, you will learn something. I remember testing putting cabbage and peppers together, and the peppers did not do well. And then now I'm thinking about it. I'm like, do I ever eat cabbage and peppers together? Usually not. And it wasn't until I harvested the cabbage, which I harvested earlier in the season, it's a spring crop, did the peppers actually take off. And I had a side-by-side comparison. I don't know if you remember this from some of my YouTube videos. This was probably 2023, but I had one particular bed that had peppers and carrots together, and I had one that had peppers and cabbage together, and it was night and day how those two behaved. But the point is I tested it and I learned it, and that's what I would like to encourage you to do. But the point is that sometimes we make gardening, and I've done this as well, a little bit too overwhelming, trying to figure out all the things. And learning how to streamline these things and to make them simpler, but also make it productive is really at the heart of what I'm teaching inside the Productive Garden Masterclass. This is where we take ideas like we talked about today and break it down to foundations you need to start making confident garden decisions. We'll talk through how I think about layout, timing, and pairing crops, both in a companion way and in a succession way, in a way that works for your life and for your garden. Now, the classes, they start February 10th. There's going to be a couple of dates to choose from, at least 3 times to choose from. And while there'll be a replay available if you can't make it live, hopefully we've got evening and daytime classes available. But if you do attend live, we will be giving away several of my favorite garden products if you're there just for being there. But again, just registering and even watching the replay, you will have a chance to win the big giveaway of a lot of those garden products. And again, you can learn more and register at journeywithjill.net/masterclass. And until then, if you're nowhere near your garden yet, as I talk, we have snow covering, which is not that common for Arkansas, but it's been fun. Here, what I want you to do, even if you're not planting your garden yet, start paying attention in the kitchen. And as you're cooking and as you're planning meals this week, notice which vegetables and herbs keep showing up together. And as you do, consider how some of these combinations in the kitchen may actually work well in your garden too. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. This was so fun for me to be able to explore and imagine, and I can't believe it took me 13 years of gardening to cue in on this. I feel like it's a new concept because I've never heard anybody talk about it, but maybe it's just me. Regardless, I hope you got some great ideas for how you might want to incorporate companion planting in your garden. We are going to dive way more deeply into how to actually make that happen in the masterclass, and I hope to see you there very soon. Again, you can go to journeywithjill.net/masterclass, and the link is in the show notes. I hope to see you there.